before we start this last chapter of Young Men and Fire, which I think has been really informative to me about all kinds of things, and I've spent a lot of time up in Mann Gulch, so I think that this work is really valuable in its own right to anybody who wants to understand fire. However, I noticed in reading the work that there's a couple of things out there that were not done that might be helpful, that I happened to, by accident, have accomplished. One is I interviewed several smoke jumpers. Those include the son-in-law for Earl Cooley, that talks about Earl Cooley at home and what he said and experienced. There's one by Jack Dunn, about an interview of Jack Dunn, who was a contemporary of the smoke jumpers who were killed, but importantly, who worked in the tool room for Wag Dodge, and he describes what Wag Dodge is like in great detail, and the difference between his style of doing things and the way smoke jumpers usually did things on the fire line. Jack Dunn also talks about Navone and two of the other guys who were on a rescue jump with Jack, just the jump prior to the Mann Gulch fire. And then there's a smoke jumper who was a member of the 101st Airborne, who knew these guys really well and had been scheduled for being at the head of the jump list at the time of the Mann Gulch fire. But when Hellman's wife came to town from Kalispell, they went shopping, and then he went. This jumper went on another fire as a foreman or squad boss off that jump list down into the Selway. So when Hellman came back from shopping, he went back to the top of the list, and then he was next man out on the load that went to Mann Gulch. So there's other things in there. There's Jim Phillips is an interview should be looked at, because he talks about all the work that the smoke jumpers from the Helena area and nationally have done to improve the historic site there where the men were killed. And I think that's informative to some people. I think over the years I've probably spent 3 or 4 summers up there building trail and maintaining trail and access and so forth. And I've learned a lot about it. So as I read through this, though it probably seemed fast, it made sense to me. And I think it's a really great piece of work. And I do recommend that you look at some of those other interviews by smoke jumpers. You'll find them either at the Smoke Jumpers Stories Facebook group, or you'll find them on my website, johnbdriscoll.blogspot.com, and under the title of the podcast, Jumping Fires. And those ones that I mentioned are the top 5 or 6 of the 30 or so interviews. So with that, let's finish this tragedy and call her good. It's the last part 3, chapter 15. It's the final chapter of Norman McLean's book. It would be natural near the end to try to divest the fire of any personal liability to those who died in it, and to become for a moment a distant and detached spectator. It might be possible then, if ever, to see fire in something like total perspective as it became total conflagration. If you had known something about wildfire, you already would have seen spot fires twisting themselves into fire swirls, and fire swirls converging upon themselves. But viewing total conflagration is literally blinding, as sight becomes sound and the roar and the fire goes out of the head of the gulch and away and beyond, far away. The last you saw of the ground was a mole coming out of the smoke, a little more terrified than you, debating which way to go and ending the argument with itself forever by turning back into the impenetrable fire. So it is. When you cannot see the fire because of the smoke, sight becomes sound. You hear the fire as a roar of an animal without the animal, or as an attacking army blown up by the explosions of its own ammunition dump. Pictures then of a big fire are pictures of many realities, designed so they change into each other and fit ultimately into a single picture of one monster becoming another monster. The pictures and the monsters are untroubled by mathematics. The monster becomes one as it extends itself simultaneously as a monster and a real animal, or more likely just as part of a real animal after it disgorges itself. All that can be seen of it from afar are its fried gray intestines. Oddly, as destruction comes close to being total, destruction erects for a brief moment into the sexual and quickly sinks back again into destruction. Intestines stretch out all the way to the curvature of the brain. The two don't look much different, and they aren't, and they are. Thus, pictures which wildfires create of itself are at least bivisual, part of the fire's process of procreating its meanings. So, as the fire at the top of the ridge slithered through the rocks, it stretched itself out into a snake, rearing its head to see that it was on course, and using its tongue as a torch to cut through obstructions. So too, a little lower on the hillside, when the main fire paused for a moment in front of the escape fire, the red flames crowded together until they became ravaging military monsters enraged by the precocity of an obstacle in front of them. Then for a moment these deranged military monsters, blocked in their advance, raged sideways up and down the line looking for a way to pass. Small fires were left as the flanks of flame threw torches ahead, jumped the line and left something like a smoldering monster in ruins. Because of their many meanings, wildfires can be trivisual or more. Some of what even a seasoned firefighter sees never seems real. After its deranged military front is passed, pieces of the main fire remain burning fiercely in clutches of timber. Dead standing trees, especially ponderosa pine trees, full of resin, became giant candles burning for the dead. Then one would explode, disappearing from the air where it stood, detonated by its own heat. The disappearance of the tree would not be visible. It would be a theological disappearance. Immediately after the explosion, its falling would be transubstantiated into spreading waves of earth generated by its own earthquake, and after its waves had swelled and broken and passed over and under and on, it would return as sound and terminate in echoes of its earthquake, rumbling out of the sides and head of the gulch. The world then was more than ever theological, and the nuclear was never far off. By now, if not sooner, the fire had become total. It was below, above, behind, now also in front at the head of the gulch. Spot fires must have been burning there, started and grasped by burning cones and ashes blown from the approaching fires. Suddenly, in the semi-gloom, they would pop out of the ground, bivisual as little poisonous mushrooms. The bivisual mushrooms, bred instantly, swelled with impregnation and underground and above ground into a vast bulbous head with a giant stalk. The vast wildfire continued on its bivisual way. Sometimes the bulbous mushroom looked like a bulbous mushroom impregnated by a snake in the grass, and sometimes like gray brains boiling out of the crevice of the earth. Then the brains themselves became bivisual and changed again into suffering gray intestines. The atomic mushroom has become for our age the outer symbol of our inner fear of the explosive power of the universe. It is the symbol of a whole age, and it took an artist to express the meaning the mushroom has for us. Henry Moore, one of our age's most expressive sculptors, commemorated the occasion that led to the atomic age, the first self-sustained nuclear reaction on the site of the University of Chicago where it occurred. His bronze atomic mushroom with its hollow eyes is intentionally bivisual from every point of view. Wherever you stand, the bronze looks like both an atomic mushroom and a skull, and is meant to. When the blow-up rose out of Mann Gulch and its smoke merged with the jet stream, it looked much like an atomic explosion in Nevada on its cancerous way to Utah. When last seen, the trivisual figure had stretched out, and was on its way far, far, far away, looking like death, and looking back at its dead, and looking forward to its dead yet to come. Perhaps it could see all of us. No one could know the power of it. It stretched until it became particles on the horizon, where it may have joined the company of sky spirits as particles, knowing what we do not know, probably something nuclear. Now, almost 40 years later, small trees have just started to grow along the bottoms of dry finger gulches. on the hillside in Mann Gulch, where moisture from rain and snow are retained underground. Since even now these little evergreens are only 6 or 8 inches high, the grass has to be parted to find them. But I look for such things. I see better what happens in grass than on the horizon. Most of us do, and probably it's just as well. But that's what's found buried in grass doesn't tell us how it got out of the way. Tell us how to get out of the way. At the end, our point of view of the fire changes radically so that we no longer look down from the distant horizon and see in the blinding smoke only pictures composed of our primitive history and our nuclear future. Instead, now, at the end, we stay as close to the ground as we can, are guided by our compassion, and accompany highly select young men who never once realized that they could be mortal on their way to the obliterating earth. We should hope, though, in trying to identify ourselves with them, that we will be able to retain our own identity for their sake as well as ours, because we are much older than they were ever to be and have lived in a time more advanced scientifically than theirs. We should know much that they did not know, but that should be of value in this journey of compassion. In a journey of compassion, what we have ultimately as our guide is whatever understanding we may have gained along the way of ourselves and others, chiefly those close to us, so close to us that we have lived daily in their sufferings. From here on, then, in the blinding smoke, it is no longer a seeing world, but a feeling world, the pain of others and our compassion for them. Things moved rapidly to the end after the crew left the foreman at his escape fire. It makes no difference whether the crew could not understand in the roaring of the main fire what Dodge was trying to say to them, or whether they thought his idea of lying down in the hot ashes of his own fire was crazy. Either way, they were entering no man's land, lonely in the boiling semi-darkness of the main fire, which by now must have been less than 50 yards behind them. Rumsey and Salih ahead of them testified that the smoke parted enough for them to see the top of the ridge only 2 or 3 times. If we have difficulty seeing the rest of the men, they had difficulty seeing themselves. Heat and loneliness were becoming the only remaining properties. Their loneliness loomed up suddenly. They were young and not used to being alone, and as smoke jumpers they were not allowed to be alone except in that perilous moment after they jumped from the sky and before they landed on earth. It has been said since tragedy was first analyzed that it is governed by the emotions of fear and pity. As the smoke jumpers went up the hill after leaving Dodge, it was like a great jump backwards into the sky. They were suddenly and totally without command, and suddenly without structure, and suddenly free to disintegrate, and free finally to be afraid. The evidence is that they were not afraid before this moment, but now great fear suddenly possessed the empty spaces. Beyond the world of sight, and soon even beyond fear, the non-human elements of heat and toxic gases were becoming the only 2 elements, and soon heat was even burning out fear. To find a place that was cool was all that was left of human purpose. Knowing at least this much about fire and mortality, we can guess why most of the dead young men were found in depressions on the hillside. There it was thought to be cooler. So it was there that most of them went before they fell. From our knowledge of others close to us, we may learn something about how it felt, this near the end. In the spring of the year, my wife died from cancer of the esophagus. She remarked to me, "I feel as if I had spent all winter with my head under water." Later, when I asked a doctor what he thought it must be like to die in a fire, not from the burning, but from the suffocation and lack of oxygen, he replied, "It's not terrible," and then added, "But it's not as an afterthought," and then added, "But not as an afterthought. It is something like drowning." If you compare my wife's remarks to this more scientific attempt to speak of death by suffocation, you can see how careful my wife was when she allowed herself to speak of such matters, to speak with precision. It was not, therefore, for most of them, a terrible death. Many of the bodies were terribly burned when they were found, so much so that it was discovered the caskets should not even be brought into the funeral chapel. Even so, they did not die of burning. The burning came afterwards. To project ourselves into their final thoughts will require feelings about a special kind of death, the sudden death and fire of the young, elite, unfulfilled, and seemingly unconquerable. As elite of young men, they felt more surely than most who are young that they were immortal, so if we are about to feel with them, we must feel that we are set apart from the rest of the universe, and safe from fires, all of which are expected to be put out by 10 o'clock the morning after. Smoke jumpers are dropped on them. So as to what they felt about sudden death, we can start by feeling what the unfulfilled always feel about it. And since the unfulfilled are many, the Book of Common Prayer cries out for all of them and us when it begs that we all be delivered from sudden death. Good Lord, deliver us from lightning and tempest, from earthquake, fire, and flood, from plague, pestilence, and famine, from battle and murder, and from sudden death. Good Lord, deliver us. One thing is certain about these final thoughts. There was not much size to them. Time and place did not permit even superior young men dying suddenly to see their whole lives pass in review. Although books portray people preparing to die as seen a sort of documentary movie of their lives, everything, however, gets smaller on its way to becoming eternal. It is also probable that the final thoughts of elite young men dying suddenly were not seen or scenic thoughts, but were cries or a single cry of passion, often of self-compassion, justifiable if those who cry are justly proud. The two living survivors of the Mann Gulch Fire have told me that, as they went up the last hillside, they remember thinking, "My God, how could you do this to me? I cannot be allowed to die so young and so close to the top." They said they could remember hearing their voices saying this out loud. One of the two great tragic emotions this close to the end, fear, had been burned away and pity was in sole possession. Not only is it heat that burns fear away, the end of tragedy purifies itself of it. Before the end of a tragedy, the most famous of tragic heroes can stand in fear before the ghost, and can shake in front of apparitions of those they have murdered. But by the end of the same tragedy has purged these same tragic heroes of fear, as is made immortally clear by the last lines of one of the most famous of these tragic heroes. "Lay on, Macduff, and damned be him that first cries, 'Hold enough.'" The pity that remains is perhaps the last and only emotion felt if it is the young and unfulfilled who suffer the tragedy. It is pity in the form of self-pity, and the compassion felt for themselves by the tragic young is self-pity transformed into some divine bewilderment. One of the few emotions in which the young and the universe are the only characters. Although divine bewilderment addresses its grief to the universe, it only cries out to it. It has to find its answers, if at all, in its own final act. It is not to be found among the answers God gave to Job in a whirlwind. The most eloquent expression of this cry was made by a young man who came from the sky and returned to it, and who, while on earth, knew he was alone and beyond all other men, and who, when he died on a hill. About the 9th hour he cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Although we can enter their last thoughts and feelings only by indirection, we are sure of the final act of many of them. Dr. Hawkins, the physician who went in with the rescue crew the night the men were burned, told me that after the bodies had fallen, most of them had risen again, taken a few steps, and fallen again, this final time, like pilgrims in prayer, facing the top of the hill, which on that slope is nearly east. Ranger Jansen, in charge of the rescue crew, independently made the same observation. The evidence, then, is that at the very end, beyond thought and beyond fear and beyond even self-compassion and divine bewilderment, there remains some firm intention to continue doing forever and ever what we last hoped to do on earth. But this final act, they had come about as close as body and spirit can to establishing a unity of themselves with earth, fire, and perhaps the sky. This is as far as we are able to accompany them. When the fire struck their bodies, it blew their watches away. The two hands of a recovered watch had melted together at about 4 minutes to 6. For them, that may be taken as the end of time. It was 6:10 by Dodge's watch when he rose from the ashes of his own fire. From then on, Dodge had his own brief tragedy to lead, which in some ways also must be considered a part of this tragedy. We leave the dead on the hillside with a promise made to me at the Office of Air Operations and Fire Management of Region 1 of the United States Forest Service, that their crosses will always be renewed. I, an old man, have written this fire report, among other things. It was important to me, as an exercise for old age, to enlarge my knowledge and spirit so I could accompany young men whose lives I might have lived on their way to death. I have climbed where they climbed, and in my time I have fought fire and inquired into its nature. In addition, I have lived to get a better understanding of myself and those close to me, many of them now dead. Perhaps it is not odd at the end of this tragedy, where nothing much was left of the elite who came from the sky but courage struggling for oxygen, that I have found myself thinking of my wife on her brave and lonely way to death. There's another interview by a fellow named Raleigh, who had been a smoke jumper with these guys and saw the smoke as he came back from Great Falls. His wife had talked him into getting out of the jumpers because she thought it was too dangerous. So he was working for the Census Bureau, and he said he saw the smoke column, and then he went on up to Rhett's funeral home, and he spent some time by himself there with the bodies of the men that were his friends. It's quite an interesting interview.